All right, so here's a question for the day. The title is called Sensitive Communities. So they say, what's up with every other BDSM community on Reddit being so sensitive? You think a group of people who enjoyed beating each other and denigrating each other would be the opposite of sensitive. But no, that statement was just a joke. Of course, we're all for safe, sane, and consensual, but when discussing these things, people feel the need to bring up points that are just not relevant and argue stupid things. I've been banned so many times from so many BDSM subreddits over dumb shit. Has anyone here noticed how sensitive these communities are as well? Edit. Curious if anyone else has been unjustly banned in the various BDSM subreddits. All right, so what do you think?
So this question, I think, raises, well, at least three different things for me. So one is, and maybe the most relevant one, is it reflects to some degree a common misunderstanding about BDSM and the people who engage in BDSM, is the notion that they would be the opposite of sensitive. And in fact, actually, I think people who participate in BDSM are probably more sensitive than average. It requires a significant degree of empathy. It requires you to be sensitive to what your partner is experiencing because you are pushing them closer to the limits of their tolerance. And as you're pushing them, you have to read them much more accurately. And I think it leans more toward more sensitive people. And you see that a little bit in the BDSM demographic information. You'll see that BDSM participants skew more educated, skew more intelligent, and have better mental health on average, right? And so there's some interesting notions there that there's a misperception inherent in the question about who it is that participates in BDSM. The second thing I think it brings up is the notion of the communities, the BDSM communities, and their tendencies. I think that of necessity, and it's one of the reasons I don't necessarily participate in these communities very much, BDSM being in the domain of the psychological shadows, harnessing kind of these deeper and darker kind of erotic forces, has always been marginalized by society. It should be marginalized by society in order for society to work correctly. And the challenge then is that the communities that are based around that want to go the other way and be as open as possible. And so they skew much more progressive than would be expected otherwise and become open to the edges of what might be considered quote-unquote kink. So non-binary, trans, all these political issues that are perhaps not directly kink related, but are kink adjacent. And the community has to, on some level, most of these communities have to be open to those sub-communities because we all have been marginalized by society at large, and so then it becomes a bit odd to marginalize other people who are participating in sexuality differently, so on and so forth. So I think that the nature of the community also hinges toward sensitivity in that direction, right? It's a response to having been marginalized and the desire not to marginalize. The challenge, however, and I think that's, so first of all, this particular guy apparently just has been an asshole in different ways. So maybe it's not a great example of him particularly, but I myself also don't necessarily feel super comfortable posting in these communities, partly because if I have a particular viewpoint or perspective that does not align super well with the progressive trans non-binary sort of framework, I end up being marginalized out of the community, which is an interesting challenge, right? And there's aspects to this. I think people that are engaging in kink tend to likely be higher in openness as a personality trait, right? I think that those same people will likely be open to the newer frameworks of progressivism in terms of gender identity and so on and so forth. And so I'm very high in trait openness, but I'm not super open to those aspects, which puts me in an odd category, and therefore I don't fit super well with the community, right? But I'm probably a tiny minority. I would suspect that relative to the number of people that participate in BDSM, most of them skew fairly strongly in that direction. So yeah, I think those are two things that came up. There was a third one. The notion of the unjust ban, right? If the community is protecting itself, as all communities do, and you are representing a viewpoint that is not conducive to the group identity, then, and that comes from, hey, look, I don't believe in multiple genders, I don't believe in trans or any of these things, I'm more conservative in those ways, then there's a conflict there, and the community will act to defend itself. And part of that, I think, is bans on the basis of this quote-unquote sensitivity. And that's where I was going with this, is the notion of sensitivity is interesting. Am I being too sensitive, or are you being too aggressive? Well, it's not clear in any particular circumstance. There's norms that are being asserted there. Is what constitutes being too sensitive? What constitutes being too aggressive? That's changed over time, right? I'm not stabbing you in the throat physically with a sword, so maybe I'm not being aggressive. But that's a pretty far definition of aggression, right? Versus if I wag my finger at you, is that a microaggression? If I raise my voice or I speak firmly, is that too aggressive, right? And so similarly, even in these online communities, the question of what constitutes too aggressive, too firm of an argument, right? I think it can be very unclear, and particularly given the leanings of these BDSM communities, I think it will tend to lean toward protecting sensitive people. I think BDSM also is an area that can be rife for abuse, and as a result, the communities that crop up around it are, of necessity, slanted strongly toward protecting anyone who's being predatory. Because the topic of the community, kink itself, attracts predators because it's a group of submissives who are looking to experience some version of predation, but they want to do it safely. Well, now you've got an area that predisposes a vulnerable population, and the community that grows up around that will tend to be sensitive to symbols of predation, and there's never going to be a perfect line drawing there.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm getting out of your answer is this idea that BDSM or kink community is not a monolithic community where we all believe in the same, or we have the same political leanings or the same perspectives on things that are currently viewed as social issues, whether that be gender identity or things like abortion or which way you lean politically,
Correct.
left or right, even though there's this sense that kinksters and BDSMers, maybe there are all these left-wing hippies smoking pot and getting tattoos, but
and listen to that rock and roll music.
Yeah, or dyeing their hair purple or something, right? That's what the BDSM community is. I remember I was at a park in a large major city, and you could tell that there was very likely a kink-based meetup going on, and all of the people there, lots of piercings, lots of tattoos, lots of pink hair, and other like wild hair as well. And before I really got into kink myself, I identified those people as part of the kink community. Right, and we know each other in real life. I know that you are none of those things. Your hair is not pink or purple or any other shocking color. And you and I both have views that would be considered conservative by a lot of people in the forums that we run into on BDSM. The implication that all BDSM kink people are just sort of naturally left-leaning, it's, paradoxically exclusionary, right, to those who don't lean that way.
Correct. No, exactly right. I mean, just the... And okay, there's a couple factors there. One is the notion of a community itself. I think people who are kinky and conservative, on average, may be kinky and conservative in their own homes quietly to themselves, right? And are not part of that conservatism may be, hey, I'm not interested in engaging with my sexuality in public. That's a private thing. And so I'm not a part of the BDSM community. Then the people who are looking to be more community oriented around their sexuality, there's a publicness to their sexuality there, may skew more progressive, more left leaning, right? And so yes, you create those things. Now, obviously, it is a constant self-contradiction on the left of the notion of wanting to be inclusive, except for people who are not inclusive, right? And so, and it's understandable, right? But that is inclusivity is their sort of moral line, and as a result, they exclude people who are not inclusive in some way, as they should in some sense. That's their structure. And overall, I would argue that sure, your experience of the pink hair and the whatever are all markers of doing things differently, but doing them differently publicly, right? And so that is itself a self-selecting group. And then if you go try to participate because, hey, I'm kinky too, well, no, but not in public generally. I'm kinky privately, monogamously to myself. And so other people in other questions have also complained. We can maybe do that another time where, hey, why does there have to be so much overlap between kink and polyamory, for instance, right? I want to be monogamously kinky with my husband or wife. Well, yeah, because the community skews that way. It has to skew that way because these are the sort of social forces. Now, as I mentioned before, people who are kinky, at least the relevant literature that we have, does seem to skew towards education, towards wealth, right? And those also are progressive factors. People will also tend to be more left-leaning in those circles. So there is also demographically some slanting. So I think there's several slanting. Personality in terms of openness, demographically in terms of wealth and education, and then just the nature of participating publicly in a community around sexuality, I think, tends to do that.